I thought my wife was pulling away. I didn't realize she'd coordinated something that required 3 strangers and my silence. It wasn't impulsive. It wasn't emotional. It was planned, times agreed on, rules understood, and one unspoken condition. I couldn't be part of it. By the time I sensed something was wrong, it wasn't a secret anymore. It was a system I was never meant to see. At first, the changes were small enough to ignore. She stayed out later than usual, but always with explanations that arrived before questions could form. She guarded her phone with a steadiness that didn't look like fear, more like discipline. She treated our life together as a fixed point she could orbit, not something she needed to stay inside. I told myself this was what long marriages looked like. Parallel routines, shared space without constant overlap. Trust meant not asking for receipts when nothing had technically gone missing. What I didn't understand was that she'd stopped improvising altogether. Everything had structure now. Nights she was busy, mornings she was unusually calm. A confidence in her movements that didn't come from happiness but from certainty. She wasn't reacting to life anymore. She was executing something she'd already decided. The first time I felt truly excluded wasn't when she lied. It was when she didn't need to. She would leave without explaining where she was going and return without offering details, because she knew I wouldn't ask. She had learned my limits better than I had. She understood that my silence could be counted on. That realization unsettled me more than any message could have. I didn't stumble onto the truth in a dramatic way. There was no confrontation, no sudden confession. What I found came in fragments, overheard phrases, a message preview that didn't make sense until it did. A pattern that only became visible once I stopped trying to look away. It happened on a Tuesday night, the kind that dissolves into background noise if nothing interrupts it. I was rinsing a glass at the sink when her phone buzzed on the counter behind me. She was in the shower. I wasn't snooping. The screen lit up on its own, bright enough to catch my eye in the reflection of the window. 3 names appeared together in a single thread. No last names, no context. Familiarity without explanation. Same place, same time. We're all in. I dried my hands slowly, as if moving too fast would make the words disappear. I didn't touch the phone. I didn't need to. The sentence lodged itself somewhere behind my ribs and stayed there, heavy and unexplained. When she came back into the kitchen, hair damp, wrapped in a towel, she smiled at me like everything was intact. "You want tea?" she asked. I watched her hands while she poured it, steady, practiced, no tremor, no hesitation. She didn't look like someone who had narrowly avoided being caught. She looked like someone whose plan was proceeding on schedule. Over the next few days, the fragments began to line up. Not neatly, not kindly, but enough to form a shape. She started dressing differently when she went out alone, not provocatively, intentionally, like she was preparing for a role. She laughed more at her phone, then stilled herself when she noticed me watching. She stopped sharing plans and started offering summaries after the fact. "I'm meeting people," she said once, when I asked where she'd been. "Just people, people." I nodded like that was an answer. Like asking for more would make me controlling. Like trust didn't require context. The night everything broke open arrived without warning. I woke to an empty bed and checked the clock, just past midnight. She hadn't said she was going out. Her side of the bed was still warm, the sheets disturbed like she'd left in a hurry and expected to return before I noticed. I sat up and listened. The house was quiet. No footsteps, no running water. I checked the front door and saw her shoes were gone. Her jacket too. I waited. I don't know why. Hope, maybe. Or denial dressed up as patience. She came back hours later, just before dawn. I pretended to be asleep and listened to her move through the room with care, the way people do when they're trying not to wake someone they believe has a right to questions. She slid into bed beside me, her breathing slowing artificially fast, like she'd rehearsed this. In the morning, she acted normal, cheerful even. She asked if I wanted eggs or toast. She kissed my cheek like it was a habit she hadn't forgotten how to perform. I watched her face and realized something unsettling. She wasn't nervous. That's when I knew whatever was happening had already been normalized somewhere else. Later that day, while she showered again, her phone buzzed. This time close enough that I could see the lock screen clearly without touching it. 3 names, same thread. Next time, same setup? My stomach dropped, not because of jealousy, but because of scale. This wasn't a single secret. It was coordinated, planned, a shared understanding that I didn't exist in the room where decisions were being made. That evening, I didn't accuse. I asked. "Are you happy?" I said, standing in the doorway while she folded laundry. She paused, surprised by the question. "Why?" "I just want to know." She studied me for a long moment, measuring something internally. Then she said, "I don't know how to answer that without hurting you." The truth arrived in pieces after that. Not a flood, not a dramatic confession. Carefully chosen admissions, released like pressure valves. She hadn't cheated with one person. She hadn't even cheated impulsively. She'd sought out anonymity, separation, a version of herself that didn't belong to anyone else. "It wasn't about replacing you," she said, eyes fixed on the floor. "It was about feeling uncontained." When I asked how many, she hesitated. 3, she said finally, at the same time. The words landed with a dull finality, like a door closing softly but permanently. Not because of the number, but because of the intention it implied. This wasn't an accident or a moment of weakness. It was a choice made in stereo, then in surround sound. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need images I could never erase. I asked one question instead. "Did you think about me?" She nodded slowly. "I thought you'd never know." That was the moment our marriage stopped being a shared story and became parallel ones. Hers, full of rooms I'd never entered. Mine, suddenly emptied of assumptions I hadn't realized I relied on. I slept on the couch that night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how a person could be so present and so absent at the same time. How intimacy could be diluted without being replaced. How trust could be broken not by passion, but by logistics. By morning, I understood something that frightened me more than the betrayal itself. This wasn't about who she'd been with. It was about who she'd decided not to be with me anymore. And whatever came next would require me to learn how to live with a truth that refused to stay singular. Because the damage wasn't loud, or sudden, or even angry. It was organized. And I was only just beginning to see how far it reached. The days after her admission passed in a strange suspension, like time had lost its edges. We moved through the house politely, cautiously, as if noise itself might shatter something already cracked beyond repair. She didn't pack a bag. I didn't ask her to leave. Neither of us pretended things were fine, but neither of us knew what replacing fine was supposed to look like. What surprised me most wasn't how much she talked afterward. It was how little she did. No grand apologies, no desperate explanations, no emotional bargaining. She seemed relieved, almost, like a weight had been lifted by finally saying the word 3 out loud, as if naming it had turned something chaotic into something manageable. That realization hurt more than anger ever could. I started noticing details I'd ignored before, patterns that now felt obvious. Her calendar, once loose and flexible, was suddenly rigid. Blocks of time that repeated weekly, always justified with vague language. Dinner, meeting, time out. Words that sounded harmless until you understood they were placeholders for something else entirely. She didn't ask me to forgive her. She asked me to understand. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," she said one evening, sitting across from me at the table where we used to eat together. "I was trying to feel like myself again." "Which self?" I asked. She didn't answer. That silence lingered long after she went to bed. I began replaying the last year of our marriage in reverse, pulling at moments that had seemed insignificant at the time. The nights she'd come home energized, not tired. The mornings she'd been unusually calm. like someone who'd already released tension somewhere else. The way she'd sometimes look at me with something like gratitude. Not love, not guilt, but appreciation for not asking questions. I understood then that my role hadn't been husband. It had been facilitator. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This hadn't been an escape from our marriage. It had been built alongside it, carefully, deliberately, with me positioned as the stable background against which everything else could happen safely. That realization changed how I looked at her. Not with hatred, with distance. I asked questions then, not about what they did or where or how. I asked about logistics, about planning, about boundaries. "How did you even meet them?" I asked one afternoon. She hesitated, then answered plainly. "Separately. At first, it took time. Time. So this wasn't spontaneous," I said. "No," she admitted. "It took coordination." The word landed hard. Coordination meant intention. It meant rules. It meant she'd sat somewhere, alone or with them, and decided what she was willing to risk and what she was willing to keep untouched. I already knew the answer, but I asked anyway. "Why 3?" She looked uncomfortable for the first time. Not ashamed, exposed. "Because one would have felt like an affair," she said. "This didn't." I stared at her. "What did it feel like?" "Temporary," she said. "Contained. Contained." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it explained everything. She hadn't wanted intimacy. She'd wanted control. She'd wanted an experience that began and ended on her terms, with clear entry and exit points, something our marriage no longer provided. That night I moved into the guest room. Not dramatically, not angrily, just quietly took my pillow and closed a door that had always been open. The separation felt symbolic more than practical, but symbols matter when reality starts slipping. Lying there, staring at a different ceiling, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Not because the betrayal hurt less, but because uncertainty was gone. The guessing, the second guessing, the slow erosion of trust disguised as patience. All of it had been replaced by a clear, brutal truth. She had chosen something else, and she had chosen it carefully. Over the next week, the house grew quieter, not with tension, but with absence. We coordinated schedules like roommates. We spoke when necessary. We avoided the past tense because it asked questions neither of us wanted to answer yet. Friends noticed. They always do. They asked if everything was okay. We both said yes. Not because it was true, but because explaining would have required language we didn't yet have. One evening, as I was leaving for a walk, she stopped me in the hallway. "They're done," she said. I turned back. "What?" "I ended it," she clarified. "All of it." I studied her face, searching for relief, or fear, or expectation. I found none of those. "Why now?" I asked. She hesitated. "Because I saw what it did to you." That was the moment something solidified inside me. "Did you?" I asked quietly. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. I nodded. "I don't think you did." I walked out before she could respond. The night air felt sharp, grounding. I walked for hours, letting the city blur into background noise while my thoughts finally arranged themselves into something coherent. This wasn't about repairing trust. It was about redefining reality. I realized then that I wasn't angry because she'd been with 3 strangers. I was angry because she'd built an entire system that relied on my absence, my silence, as a feature, not a flaw. That meant something fundamental had already ended before I ever knew it was at risk. When I came home, the house was dark. She was asleep. I stood in the doorway of the guest room for a long time, listening to the quiet, and made a decision that surprised even me. I wasn't going to rush anything. No ultimatums, no dramatic exits, no immediate demands for closure. I was going to observe. Because if she'd been capable of organizing that level of separation while sharing a life with me, then there were parts of her I still didn't understand. and understanding them mattered more than reacting. I needed to know what else had been compartmentalized, what else had been decided without me, and whether the man she thought would stay silent had finally learned how to speak. Just not yet. I didn't learn the truth all at once. That would have been merciful. Instead, it arrived sideways, disguised as coincidence, wearing a familiar face I hadn't seen in years. It started with a name. I was sitting at the kitchen table one afternoon, scrolling aimlessly through my phone, pretending not to listen to the muffled sounds of my wife moving around upstairs. She'd been quieter since our last conversation, less defensive, less certain, like someone who knew the ground beneath her wasn't stable anymore. A message notification lit up on my screen. An old group chat I hadn't opened in years. The name at the top made my chest tighten before my mind caught up. Ethan. I hadn't spoken to him since my early 20s. Childhood friend. One of the 3 people who knew me before I learned how to be careful with my trust. We'd grown up on the same block, same scraped knees, same stolen beers behind garages. He'd been there when my father died. He'd stood next to me at my wedding. "Hey man," the message read. "Long time. Weird question, but how are things with you and your wife?" I stared at the screen, my pulse picking up in a way that felt instinctive, not logical. The question wasn't casual. It wasn't nostalgic. It was cautious. "Why?" I typed back. There was a pause long enough to feel intentional. I just wanted to check in. That was when the hum behind the walls, the one I'd felt before everything broke, returned, louder now. I didn't answer right away. I went upstairs instead. My wife was in the bedroom, folding clothes she didn't need to fold, hands moving more than necessary. I watched her for a moment before speaking. "Do you know someone named Ethan?" I asked. She froze, not dramatically, not with denial, just enough that the air shifted. "Yes," she said carefully. "Why? How do you know him?" Another pause. Longer this time. "He's someone I met," she said. "Why?" I nodded slowly, like I was accepting an answer. "Where?" She hesitated. "Through friends." That was when I understood something I hadn't let myself consider before. These men weren't strangers, not to me. I went back downstairs and opened the old group chat fully for the first time in years. Names I hadn't seen since childhood stared back at me like ghosts I hadn't invited, but somehow recognized instantly. Ethan, Mark, Lucas. The room seemed to tilt. Mark. The same Mark who taught me how to throw a curveball when we were 12. Lucas. The one who slept on my floor for weeks after his parents divorced. 3 boys who knew my mother's cooking. My laugh before it changed. My fears before I learned how to hide them. 3 men who knew me well enough to know exactly what my silence meant. I sat there staring at their names, feeling something colder than rage settle into my chest. This wasn't anonymity. It was familiarity weaponized. I replied to Ethan, "Why are you asking now?" The dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. "Because I didn't know it was her at first," he finally wrote. "And I didn't know it was you until later." I felt dizzy. Until when? Until I recognized the house. The house. My house. The one I'd invited them into countless times over the years. The one where my wife now moved quietly upstairs, unaware that her secret had just collapsed inward on itself. I called him. He answered on the first ring. "Man," he said, voice tight. "I was hoping you wouldn't." "Which one of you suggested it?" I asked. No greeting, no small talk. Silence. "That doesn't matter," he said finally. "It does to me." Another pause. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I laughed, a sharp sound that didn't belong to me. "You grew up with me. You knew exactly what this would be like." "We didn't know it was her," he said quickly. "At first, it was supposed to be anonymous. And when you found out?" Silence again. "You didn't stop," I said. "No," he admitted. "We didn't." I ended the call and sat there, hands shaking, not from shock, but from the sudden clarity of it all. This wasn't just betrayal. It was recognition twisted into permission. They hadn't chosen her despite me. They'd chosen her because of me, because they knew my patterns, my restraint, my instinct to stay quiet and reasonable. They knew I wouldn't explode, that I'd absorb. And my wife had known who they were. I confronted her that night, not angrily, calmly. The calm that comes when something irreversible has already happened. "You knew them," I said. She didn't pretend anymore. She nodded. "Once." "How long?" "Before," she whispered. "Before anything happened." "You knew who they were to me." "Yes." "Why them?" Her voice broke. "Because it felt safe." Safe. I almost smiled at the irony. "Did you think about what it would do to me?" I asked. She looked up at me then, eyes full, and shook her head slowly. "I didn't think you'd ever find out who they were." That was the moment something inside me finally went quiet. Because the betrayal wasn't just physical or emotional. It was historical. She hadn't just crossed a boundary in our marriage. She'd crossed one that reached back into my childhood and rewrote it without my consent. Those friendships were gone now. Not damaged, not strained, gone. I understood that with an immediacy that surprised me. There would be no confrontation with them, no closure conversations, no dramatic reckoning. They had already chosen who they were willing to be. And so had she. That night, lying alone in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling and felt the full weight of it settle in. This wasn't a story about infidelity. It was about erasure, about how people who know you best can use that knowledge to disappear you from your own life, quietly, efficiently, without ever raising their voices. And I knew then that whatever came next wouldn't be loud. It would be deliberate, because the people who thought they understood my silence had mistaken it for weakness. And they were about to learn the difference. The strangest part was how quickly my mind stopped asking why and started asking what now. Once I knew the three men weren't strangers. Once I could see their faces on my street again, overlaid on every memory I'd ever trusted. My emotions didn't get louder. They got sharper, like my grief had finally found a shape it could grip. My wife didn't beg me not to tell anyone, not at first. She just watched me move around the house like a man learning the dimensions of a room after the lights go out. She tried to be helpful in small ways. Made coffee, folded towels, asked if I'd eaten. As if domestic care could erase the fact that she had built a second life using parts of mine. I didn't touch her. Not out of cruelty, out of reality. On Friday evening, she asked, "What are you going to do?" I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. "I'm going to see them." Her face changed, fear, then something like relief, then fear again. She knew what it meant when I stopped being passive. She knew, because she'd counted on my passivity like it was an agreement. "You can't," she whispered. "I can," I said. "I just haven't." She started crying then, quiet and steady, like the tears had been waiting for permission. "They didn't mean anything," she said. It meant enough to organize," I cut in. My voice was calm, and that seemed to scare her more than anger. It meant enough to involve my past. She tried to reach for my hand. I stepped back, not dramatically. Just one pace, a clean refusal. "Please," she said, "don't turn this into something bigger." That sentence hit me like a confession, because that was exactly what she'd been doing, containing it, managing it, keeping it from becoming bigger, so she wouldn't have to face what it actually was. I left without another word. I didn't go to a bar. I didn't go to a friend. I drove to the old park near our childhood neighborhood, the one place I knew Ethan would still recognize if I suggested it. I texted him 2 words, "Come alone." He replied almost immediately, "Okay." I sat on a bench under a dim streetlight and watched cars pass like they had nothing to do with my life. My hands didn't shake. My heart didn't race. I felt emptied out in a way that made everything else feel strangely simple. Ethan arrived 10 minutes later, shoulders hunched against the cold, looking around like he expected an ambush. When he saw me, he stopped. He didn't smile. He didn't apologize. He just looked ashamed. Finally, too late. Man, he said softly. I didn't know what else to do. I let the silence stretch until he had to fill it. You didn't know what else to do, I repeated. He swallowed. I should have told you. Yes, I said. You should have. He looked down at his hands. It wasn't supposed to be connected to you. It started as... He stopped, as if the words tasted ridiculous, even to him. It started as something separate. Nothing is separate, I said. Not when you grew up in my house, not when you know my mother's name, not when you stood next to me at my wedding. His eyes glistened. I know. I nodded. Then tell me something real. Who suggested it after you recognized her? Ethan flinched. Lucas. I felt a cold wave move through my chest. Lucas had always been the bold one, the one who treated consequences like rumors. And Mark? I asked. Ethan hesitated. Mark didn't want to stop. That hurt in a different way, because Mark had always been the quiet, loyal one, the steady friend, the one you expected to choose decency even when no one was watching. My voice stayed even. So you all knew who she was? Yes. And you continued. He didn't argue. He didn't defend. He just nodded once, like his body couldn't carry denial anymore. I sat back on the bench and stared out at the dark grass, remembering us as boys, laughing, shoving, swearing we'd never become the kind of men who did this. Then I looked at Ethan again. Do you understand what you took from me? He whispered. Your marriage. No, I said. My past. My ability to remember it without this attached. He covered his face with one hand, as if that physical gesture could block the truth from entering. I'm sorry, he said. I believed he meant it. That was the tragedy. A sincere apology doesn't reverse a choice. It only proves you understood it after you made it. I stood up. Here's what's going to happen. Ethan looked up quickly, hopeful, terrified. You're going to tell the other two that they will never speak to me again, I said. No texts, no calls, no, let's talk it out. Nothing. He nodded, frantic. Okay. And if any of you try to contact my wife, I continued, I will tell everyone, not out of revenge, out of honesty, because I'm done being the only one living in reality. Ethan's face tightened. You're going to tell people? I paused. This was the choice. The fork in the road that had been waiting for me since the first message preview lit up. If I stayed quiet, I could keep the surface of my life intact. Keep friendships on life support, keep family gatherings normal, keep my wife from being judged, keep myself from being pitied. But silence had already cost me too much. I'm going to tell the people who matter, I said, because I'm not carrying this alone anymore. Ethan exhaled like he'd been punched. You don't have to destroy her, he said weakly. I looked at him, and something in my voice finally sharpened. She didn't destroy herself by accident. She built this. She recruited the worst possible history to build it with. His eyes dropped again. He had no defense left. When I drove home, my wife was sitting in the living room with the lights off, like she'd been waiting in a courtroom for the verdict. Her face was blotchy from crying. She stood when I walked in. Well, she whispered. I took off my coat slowly, deliberately, and set my keys on the table. My body felt steady, like it had finally accepted that the life I wanted was no longer available. I'm telling my brother, I said. Tomorrow. Her mouth opened. No sound came out at first. Then, please. I shook my head once. I'm not asking for permission. She stepped toward me, hands trembling. If you tell people, there's no coming back. I looked at her and felt the truth settle into words. There's already no coming back, I said. The only thing that changes is whether I keep disappearing so you can pretend this was contained. She crumpled onto the couch, sobbing into her hands. And I stood there, feeling grief and clarity coexisting in my chest like two weather systems colliding. I walked past her, up the stairs, into the bedroom that no longer felt like ours. I opened the closet and pulled out a suitcase. Behind me, her voice rose. Raw, desperate. "What are you doing?" I paused with my hand on the zipper and finally said the sentence I'd been avoiding since the night I found out who the strangers were. "I'm leaving," I said. "Not because I hate you, because I can't live inside a marriage that required 3 people from my childhood to make you feel free." She made a sound like she might say my name, like she might try to pull me back with it. But I didn't turn around. Because if I turned around, I knew I'd see the version of her that wanted comfort, and I might forget, just for a moment, what she had chosen. And I couldn't afford to disappear again. Everyone assumed the ending would be simple. Divorce papers, public fallout, sides taken, 3 former friends quietly erased. A wife left to explain herself to a world that finally knew. That's how stories like this are supposed to end. Clean lines, clear villains, a man walking away bruised but intact. That's what I thought too. I left the house with a single suitcase and checked into a small apartment across town, one that smelled faintly of fresh paint and anonymity. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, not out of secrecy, but because I needed one place in my life that hadn't been contaminated by shared history. The calls came anyway. Friends, family, questions wrapped in concern, concern wrapped in curiosity. I answered what I could and ignored the rest. I didn't feel like a victim anymore. I felt like a witness to my own life from a necessary distance. The divorce moved forward quietly. No fighting, no negotiations dragged into cruelty. My wife didn't contest anything. She didn't ask for reconciliation. She didn't try to reframe what she'd done as confusion or freedom or self-discovery. She accepted the consequences with a stillness that unsettled me more than resistance would have. The 3 men disappeared from my life exactly as promised. No messages, no apologies sent through intermediaries. It was as if they'd collectively agreed that silence was the last remaining currency they had. Months passed, and then something happened that rewrote everything. I was sitting alone one evening, eating takeout on the floor because I hadn't bothered to buy a table yet, when my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. I answered by accident. "Hi," a woman said gently. "You don't know me. My name is Rachel. I think you should sit down." I already was. She explained slowly, carefully, like someone delivering news that had been heavy in their hands for a long time. She was married. To Mark. One of the 3. She'd found messages months earlier. At first, she assumed it was an affair. Singular, ugly but explainable. Then she kept digging, and found the group, the planning, the coordination, the shared rules. And then she found something else. A folder, screenshots, notes, conversations not just about my wife, but about me, my routines, my temperament, my likelihood of staying silent, jokes about how he won't say anything and he never does. They hadn't just known who I was. They'd studied me. Rachel's voice broke when she said, "I didn't just want to leave him. I wanted you to know you weren't crazy." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, feeling something unexpected rise in my chest. Not rage, relief. Because the final illusion, the one that suggested this had all been a mistake, or impulsive, or emotionally driven, collapsed completely. This had been deliberate. Not just on my wife's part, on all of theirs. I forwarded the information to my lawyer. I didn't confront my wife. I didn't need to. The shock didn't come from exposure. It came from what happened next. 2 weeks later, my wife asked to meet. She looked different. Not defeated, not guilty. Just empty. Like someone who had finally run out of stories to tell herself. "I know you spoke to Rachel," she said quietly. I didn't confirm it. She nodded anyway. "I didn't know they talked about you like that." I studied her face, waiting for something inside me to move. Nothing did. "I thought I was escaping," she continued. "I didn't realize I was participating." "That's the difference," I said. "You were escaping, they were strategizing." She flinched. Then she said something I still haven't fully absorbed. "They didn't choose me," she whispered. "They chose against you." And suddenly, everything made a terrible kind of sense. This hadn't been about desire or freedom or novelty. It had been about proximity to something familiar they could violate together, something that bound them through shared history and shared secrecy. Me, the most unexpected part, the part no one could have predicted, was what I did after that realization. I didn't expose them publicly. I didn't take satisfaction in watching their marriages collapse. I didn't even attend the final hearing in person. I walked away from all of it. Completely. I changed cities, changed jobs, changed routines. I let my past remain where it belonged, behind me, fully accounted for, no longer active. The last thing I heard, months later, came secondhand. The three men no longer speak to each other. Their shared secret didn't bond them. It poisoned them. One marriage ended quietly. Another didn't survive the weight of explanation. The third exists in a version of silence that looks suspiciously like fear. And my wife? She told a mutual friend she'd never felt so alone in her life. Not because I left, but because the people she thought gave her freedom had only ever given her permission to disappear. The shock ending, the one no one expects, is this. I wasn't ruined. I wasn't even the center of it. I was the test. And once I removed myself from the equation, everything they built around my silence collapsed under the weight of being seen. I didn't win by staying. I didn't win by fighting. I won by refusing to be the background character in a story that required my absence to exist. The last time I thought about them, I realized something quietly final. They needed my silence to survive. I didn't.